Hey team, Mike here at After 40 Fitness and after40fitness.ca. Hey listen, I got a great question today. Came up in a comment on a previous video. I'll show it to you here from Shannon. He asks, how do you break a 1-day fast and then a 2 or a 3-day fast? Oh, what a simple question, but man, there's a lot to unpack right there. If this is your first time to my channel and you haven't yet, please do subscribe. Right, punch that like button for me, but don't forget to hit the bell icon and notifications. Putting out 2 or 3 videos right now a week in the keto, low-carb, intermittent fasting space. And you're going to want to know when I get a brainchild or a killer question like this one. On that note, let's get after it with what the context around intermittent fasting is and what we need to be aware of when it comes to how we break our fast. I think what we'll do to get the ball rolling is have a discussion about all the science, the relevant research that's gone into how to break a fast. And we'll decide, therefore, what foods are best to break a fast as well as what foods to avoid. And that way, we're going to come up with, let's call it a refeeding plan. The first thing that'll come up when you look at how do I refeed after a fast is something called refeeding syndrome. Have you heard that term before? Let's spend a few minutes and talk about this thing called refeeding syndrome. See, as far back as World War II, scientists became aware that when they gave starved or malnourished prisoners of war, when they gave them access to food, and of course, because we can eat on demand, unlimited amounts of food, they realized that many, they didn't get better. They didn't get healthier. They didn't get stronger. What they got was, in most cases, sick. And in some cases, they died. Now, we've since learned that that is an electrolyte and fluid issue. That introducing a ton of food to someone who's starved or malnourished causes electrolyte and fluid imbalances. At a minimum, these people developed edema, swelling. Okay, the number of fasters, in fact, it's really interesting. Go into the forums on any given day in social media, and you'll hear people saying, I broke my fast after a day or 2 or 3, and man, the bloating, the swelling, it's unbearable. And I find that remarkable because these people then just didn't attribute that to this electrolyte and fluid imbalance. This swelling, if you will, this bloating is the lowest level of refeeding syndrome. Cardiac issues are the more severe versions. Everything from arrhythmias right up to heart attacks have been noted in the worst cases. But on top of that, breathing issues, right? Lung, an impact to lungs, not to mention muscular strength or muscular weakness, right? The opposite of strength. Neurological and central nervous system issues. You got to ask yourself then, who's at risk for this refeeding syndrome? Is it something you and I need to be aware of? First, let's be clear, I'm not a doctor. Okay, I'm a boot camp coach and a certified keto coach. I'm going to offer this scientific review and my interpretation of the science, but it's purely educational and informational at best. Okay, if this is one of those things that you have any questions or doubts about, you damn well need to obviously go talk to your doctor or a nutritionist. Having said that, the first level of risk that's identified in the guidelines around refeeding syndrome is kicks in and becomes a true risk factor after 5 days of not eating anything, 5 days of fasting. These people are the ones that are first admonished to get their electrolytes checked, to get their magnesium, their potassium, their calcium, and their phosphate all checked to see the difference between intracellular versus extracellular. So in their cell versus in their bloodstream. This is where the imbalance happens. Now, what does that mean for you and I? Well, you know something on the risk scale, knowing that risk becomes elevated at 5 days, I'm going to arbitrarily recommend to you that we consider anything beyond 3 days to be where, or 72 hours of not eating, to be where the risk begins to grow. Right? This is where you and I want to stay as far away from risk as possible. And I would say that since the risk only begins to grow at 5 days, you and I in our everyday lives, we can apply a 3-day, 72-hour kind of a rule. Now there I'm going to use air quotes, right? A rule that says, we're probably in the lower risk, but so let's be aware of refeeding syndrome in 72 hours or less. Let's be aware that it exists. If you do, in fact, fast beyond the 3 days or the 72 hours, then you should spend it. The onus is on you to spend a little more time investigating refeeding syndrome and what it means. All right, I'm not going to go into much detail on this one. I'm going to assume that 99% of my listeners to the channel are 72 hours or less, but it does behoove you then to find out what's the best way to break a fast if you're going to go beyond 72 hours and take into account some of their guidelines, like making sure that you're supplementing in the right amount of those 4, I mentioned those 4 electrolytes. And the guideline on food, just so you know, a little FYI, is that they do recommend that from 5 days on, or in our case, we're going to agree to 72 hours, 3 days on, that when on the day you do break your fast, you intake about 50% of the volume of food you normally would. Right? That if you do normally eat 2,000 calories, or like my case, 2,500 calories a day, that on the day I break my fast, after 72 hours, I'm going to eat about 12, maybe 1,300 calories in smaller meals spread out, give my gut a chance to, and my electrolytes and my fluid a chance to equilibrate, is that the right word? To come to a nice equilibrium. But we're going to go ahead and assume then from this part on the video forward that we're talking about 72 hours or less. So we've agreed we're talking about fasts of less than 72 hours. Now, let me ask you something. Is there a difference between breaking a 16 and 18, my usual 18-hour fast, and a 72-hour fast? Not really. It really comes down to at that point to personal preference. See, there are many seasoned fasters, longtime fasters, who do nothing special to break the difference between an 18-hour fast, a 24, 36, 48, up to 72. They do nothing different. In fact, I personally break every fast right up to 48, which is my personal max, 48 hours. It never changes. In fact, for me, it's 100% of the time a whey smoothie, a chocolate whey isolate smoothie. Every time, 100% of the time, and I've never had any downside from that. Now, when it comes to which foods are best to break your fast with, I do believe it's the leanest protein possible. But there is one cardinal rule. It doesn't matter what you break your fast with. It doesn't matter. There's one cardinal rule, and that is don't combine carbs and fats. All right. It doesn't matter what methodology you're on. You could be Atkins, low-carb keto like me. You could be not. You could be absolutely a follower of a SAD. You want to be predominantly a protein with fat or a protein with carb, not carbs and fats put together. Now, let's discuss why that is. Insulin is released when nutrients are digested and they hit the bloodstream, right? That's when our pancreas detects the nutrients and releases insulin. This insulin signaling, it does a bunch of things in the body. Like it tells the body to burn glucose for fuel. It tells the body to partition any dietary fat in our bloodstream into adipose fat storage. It also tells the body to shuttle amino acids that are in the bloodstream into muscle cells. Something you should understand right now is the level of insulin sensitivity we have after a fast. Man, our bodies are, they're eager for nutrients and electrolytes. And when insulin gets triggered by food, but particularly by carbs, well, at a cellular level, we're ravenous. It may interest you to learn that just about all of the fat that we have is fat that we ate, right? The fat that's under our skin, our adipose fat, is a result of dietary fat. And what we need to know is that insulin spike, it'll tell our body to store glycogen. Glucose is glycogen for energy, for immediate energy, but it tells the body to take any free fatty acids that are floating in our bloodstream and put those into fat storage. If you've listened to my channel for a while, you know I really think a lot of Dr. Layne Norton. Very, very scientifically minded, gifted in that regard. And being a research scientist, he loves to talk about this particular topic, that our fat is a result of dietary fat. Notice what he says right here.
There's various research papers showing that of the fat we store, only about 1 to 2% of it comes from dietary carbohydrate. So only 1 to 2% of those carbons wind up in adipose tissue. The vast majority of the fat we store comes from the fat we eat.
So if you're like me, that's an eye-opener. I don't know about you, but I've been thinking that dietary glucose, that carbs are the major contributor to fat. Turns out it's not. That's our major contributor as a follower of a SAD to our energy sources, our energy production, our energy glycogen stores, and dietary fat becomes body fat. So profound. Now, when it comes back to this insulin response, carbs have by far the greatest impact, the greatest insulinic response, which makes sense. We know that. Protein, conversely, has a moderate or a middle ground kind of an insulin response, which is damn good for muscle growth. We need that for muscle synthesis. And fats, of course, have a negligible, almost non-existent insulin response. So what info does that recommend or suggest to you for foods to break our fast? Well, simple. According to the NICE guidelines, they definitely agreed we should prioritize protein. However, they were really ambiguous when it came to carbs versus fat to make up our energy needs. They didn't care. In fact, the only mention of carbs in the NICE guidelines was here when they say and or, right? Implying that the exact proportion of each it's immaterial to them. However, since fats do virtually nothing to trigger insulin on their own and have been shown to actually buffer the insulinic response of protein, and since we know that insulin is the primary driver of the symptoms behind refeeding syndrome, it makes sense that fats, if we're going to combine anything with protein, it should be fats. Now, for the non-ketonians watching this video, the takeaway is yes, you can have protein with carbs. And that's not at all a bad thing, just not protein with carbs and fat. You got to be pickier, choosier about your cuts of meat. However, for ketonians, we know we can have lean protein, but if not lean, then we can have good cuts of meat, of real meat, and take the fats right along with it, because we know we're not having carbs as well. Personally, I think the best solution is lean protein in the form of whey isolate. You may decide to go with pea isolate or hemp isolate. A scoop of real good chocolate whey in a cup or a cup and a half of almond milk with a dash of cinnamon. Oh, that's heaven. I love that. However, you may also want to go with one of these other options of a good cut of meat. It could be poultry or fish. Great choices. Or, look at that. Look at these options here as far as steak goes. Fish and chicken. Right, so good for us. So what we need to get away with from here is just to make sure that, again, that one caveat, that one rule is don't ever combine, or do your best not to combine anything that causes an insulin spike with the presence of both carbs and fat. Right? Either or is fine, but in the presence of both, you will store predominantly all the fat that you ingest. Try to avoid that. Now, when it comes to size of meal, let's talk about the quantity of food. Right? That's the next big topic after deciding it's going to be lean protein. How much? Breaking your fast is not about gorging. It really isn't. It's about being strategic with how you break your fast, and that means one small meal. Right? One big meal, again, increases your risk of carbs and fat simultaneously. I don't know how you could have a big meal and not, and therefore that huge insulin spike. And from that, when you combine carbs and fat and protein with a big insulin spike, you will probably end up with some sort of, especially when breaking a fast, some sort of associated fatigue or lethargy, and often even GI, gastrointestinal distress. And what to avoid when breaking your fast? I'll tell you what to avoid is anything raw. You want to eat nothing raw. Raw veggies require digestive enzymes that you just don't have in abundance right now. Even after a 16-hour fast, you're not going to enjoy trying to digest raw vegetables, and even more so as you get over 24 to 36 hours. There are other potentially problematic foods. These include nuts and seeds, their associated butters. For some people, eggs. For other people, dairy, but definitely leafy greens, and as mentioned, any non-starchy vegetables, particularly raw. Ingesting cinnamon or tea containing cinnamon is often considered by most people to be a smart move as you break your fast. Cinnamon has got a glucose modulating effect. It's often called a GDA, a glucose disposal agent. That means it mimics insulin to some degree and will also, in a backdoor kind of way, open up a cell to accept glucose out of your bloodstream. Really quite cool. And then another commonly accepted best practice is to add a teaspoon or even a tablespoon of chia seeds or psyllium husk in a glass of water before breaking your fast. So while I break my fast, and I mean every fast with this whey isolate smoothie I mentioned, and how good that is, you can definitely have a piece of poultry, a piece of fish, even a piece of steak or a piece of beef, right? Not a problem as long as there's no carbs present. So if you're keto, that means probably in the 3 to 4 ounce range when it comes to fish or chicken or a piece of beef. That would seem to have the right mix of protein and fat, an ideal blend. You can't go wrong. In the end, though, you have that one mission, and that is to avoid any physiological impacts or distress that come from breaking a fast. And typically, what has been seen and noted, and other keto gurus have commented on, Dr. Barry's mentioned it, so has Thomas DeLauer, and among others, is that predominantly or prioritize protein piece of the puzzle. And then depending if you're keto or not, you either attach a carb or you attach fat. All right, and in our case, being keto low-carb Atkins, it seems to be that protein with fat mix. And then an hour later, here's the key part, an hour later, go on to your main meal. You've prepped your digestion. You've prepped your gut biome to be ready. So an hour and a half later, when you have your full meal, you're good to go. Let's wrap up with a discussion about electrolytes while doing a 72-hour fast or less. As you know, when we fast, our dietary supply of electrolytes will typically drop, right? If you're fasting a water only, even a dry fast or a clean fast, then you're not taking in electrolytes. And because of that, the body has this mechanism whereby it pulls electrolytes out of the cells and puts them into the bloodstream for the good of the whole, right? To circulate through the body to be used where needed. The definition of refeeding syndrome is the sudden shift of fluids and electrolytes back in to the cell membranes, right? So this flood of electrolytes and fluids comes from the bloodstream when insulin kicks in and opens the door and floods back into the cell. That's potentially damaging. You'll remember we talked about insulin's role and how it gets glucose out of the bloodstream and into either muscle or liver glycogen. Well, here's where it gets interesting. When insulin opens the door to a myocyte, and that is in order to get glucose in. It also has to let in elementals. They're needed, right? Electrolytes are needed for cellular health, for glycolysis, mandatory for glycolysis actually. So insulin triggers the cells to start sucking in electrolytes at the same time as it's pulling in glucose. So because glycolysis requires this blend of electrolytes, particularly phosphate, potassium, and magnesium, these are pulled in from whatever's circulating in the blood supply. This rush of electrolytes appears to do a couple of things. First, it overflows the cell with the electrolytes, but that in turn causes too much water to rush into the cell and be held onto. Far more water, far more sodium than is usual. Now, at a minimum, this causes bloating and swelling. However, at a greater scale, this goes into edema, which then can impact our breathing, the brain, our heart, and all those issues that come along with it. How to avoid or compensate for this? Well, remember, at less than 72 hours, we're not really talking about something that's probable. It's more of a possibility that you need to be aware of. But the best solution appears, bar none, to augment your dietary electrolytes when fasting. Although I only fast for up to 3 days, the NICE guidelines and their recommendations make up the safety foundation of my refeeding plan. My refeeding plan begins immediately upon when I start my fast. So when I fast, I supplement not just sodium, right? I also see the logic in supplementing phosphate, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Right? I don't know about you, but I don't wait to become deficient in any of those, and therefore for it to become a problem. I think it's more important to support blood levels immediately, like while you're fasting, right? I just want to completely negate the chances of refeeding syndrome when I break my fast. While I won't give you a recommendation on the amount of electrolytes you should take, I'll show you what I aim to do every day of my fast. Note the amounts and the percentages of the RDAs. You'll see that by those amounts and the percentages, there's nothing overwhelming here. There's nothing extreme. There's just enough, in my opinion, in the research I've done, between intracellular versus extracellular and prevent any kind of a rebound effect when I break my fast. See, I've got to tell you something. I was gratified when I researched this topics to see that these amounts right here that I'm showing you are in line with many of the physician-monitored fasting clinics that exist throughout Canada and the US. Well, that's enough for this one. I hope you get some good information out of that. I will say this, when it comes to finding electrolytes, there's some really easy ones, some low-hanging fruit. One for sodium being pickle juice. Salt, you can find a good Redmond salt, a good Himalayan, a good Celtic sea salt. Lots of good options there in the true pure form. However, make no mistake, table salt, sodium chloride with a little bit of iodine added, so good. It'll cover your sodium need, even throw in some iodine, good for the thyroid. When it comes to magnesium and potassium, you're going to want to go buy those. Magnesium comes in many forms. Play around with it. Find out which one suits you best, which one doesn't cause diarrhea. I find personally the biglycinate, magnesium biglycinate, suits me the best, as does magnesium citrate. A couple 100 milligrams each, take 2 a day, right around 400 or 500 milligrams per day, seems to be the sweet spot. When it comes to potassium, many good sources. If you haven't heard yet of cream of tartar is about 40% potassium by mix. So go look that up. You'll also find salt alternatives like to use potassium. So look up something called no salt. No salt is largely made of potassium bicarbonate, as is new salt, either one of those. You can always just go ahead and buy magnesium potassium blends. I like one, I'll show a little glimmer of it here, called Vega Hydrator. Vega Hydrator, I'll show the ingredients on the back here. You can see in the mix, it's got some calcium and potassium. This is how I like to get the bulk of my electrolytes on a daily basis is via Vega Hydrator with pickle juice and no salt, new salt, and a little bit of cream of tartar just to augment where needed. Potassium, magnesium seem to be the one we need to supplement the most. And make no mistake, if you're cramping in any way, shape, or form, if you have muscle cramps, then you don't take in enough magnesium and potassium, plain and simple. When I saw my doctor years ago and said, can I supplement magnesium and potassium? I've got cramps. He said, absolutely. I said, how much? He said, until your muscle cramps go away. Let that be a lesson. On that note, any questions, any comments, any concerns, please do put a comment down below. Best comments, as always, get turned into a video just like this one. And thank you again, Shannon, for the question. Loved it. On that note, thanks so much for your time. Don't forget to punch that like button for me. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.